Welcome to Integral Talks, a podcast series brought to you by Integral Advisors, where we dive into the world of compliance, risk management, and due diligence, and provide you with expert insight and analysis to help you make more informed business decisions. Welcome back to Integral Talks. My name is Alberto Laportilla, and I'm President and CEO of Integral Advisors. For over 30 years now, Puerto Rico has sought to become a player in the field of international banking in the region. Laws were passed that permitted international banking licenses to banks to allow for transactions, deposits, loans, wire transfers for non-domestic customers. Citigroup and Banco Popular de Puerto Rico were among the first applicants back in the late 80s. A new law, 273 in 2012, was created to expand upon this further. Favorable tax incentives have been offered to non-domestic individuals and entities to domicile on the island in an effort to continue to spur the economy of Puerto Rico. Much of this comes in the wake of an economy that has often been set back by natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, floodings. In recent years, some of these international banking entities have come under fire by local and national regulators for violations and or deficiencies in their compliance program. Last month, FinCEN issued the Office of FinCEN, which is the Office of the U.S. Treasury Department that safeguards the financial system, issued a large fine to the tune of $50 million against a local entity. So we invited a very special guest to give us a little bit of background and make some sense of the international banking sector in Puerto Rico. Ernesto Mayoral is a leading attorney in Puerto Rico in the field of banking, security, and insurance acquisitions and on regulatory applications to federal and Puerto Rico banking agencies. He is a capital member of the law firm of Mecano Valdez, the oldest full-service law firm on the island. The firm even has a practice under international banking and financial entities, of which he is one of the practice leaders. Ranked as one of Puerto Rico's leading attorneys in the field and an active speaker at conferences and forum, please welcome Ernesto Mayoral. Welcome, Ernesto.
Thank you very much, Alberto. It's a pleasure to work with you and to collaborate in this effort to spread, good information about the goings on in the international banking business in Puerto Rico, which, as you say, has been running for more than 30 years.
Right.
Been going through its evolutions, and it's still a very active and very interesting place for the business. It keeps attracting new investors. It challenges those who are here and those who want to come in, and I think that's the mix that we want to go over a little bit with you today.
Sure, and thank you for that. And let's get right into just to start from where things are today. I want to make sure that we can separate fact from fiction. More than 10 entities, international banking entities have ceased operations in the last couple of years in Puerto Rico. There have been quite a bit of recent news about the deficiencies and among some of these institutions. FinCEN, after issuing this large fine, the director of FinCEN was quoted as saying, FinCEN is sending a message that the era of money laundering and by international banking entities in Puerto Rico is over. Very strong comment by her. So can you just put that into perspective and give the audience a little bit about what's happening today in the international banking sector in Puerto Rico?
Sure. I think an important distinction or focus of the matter of the compliance violations or fines or enforcement actions has a lot to do with the concept of the practice in a program rather than huge money laundering scandals per se.
Right.
In other words, you found, and you know that FinCEN will impose a huge fine on any entity, even if it doesn't have a technical violation, if they find their program to be somehow insufficient, inappropriate for the level of risk.
Right.
And I think there has been a lot of pressure on the local institutions and emphasis on particularly filing of SARs. The timely filing of SARs is always one of the key focus points for the enforcement actions. Not necessarily because the stars may or may not have resulted in particular violations being caught to the clients, but because of the fact that the system was not addressing the risks or the red flags that were being caught.
Right.
And there's been a lot of look back action, which is giving a lot of work to entities that do the kind of look back or assist in preparing look backs. I think my optimistic view of all of this is that this shows that the rule of law is still prevalent and is still the norm in Puerto Rico. So that violations will be captured. Anybody who's not playing by the rules, will have to face the consequences or remedy or mitigate whatever risk they have been creating by not having strong programs. But I think in general, the main thrust has been on the compliance structures themselves. And that is a very key important pressure point, but it's also one that tells you that the entities can protect themselves by having a strong compliance culture, strong compliance and competent staff, and good technical resources, which are ever more necessary in handling alerts and in handling the volume of business that some of these entities are now handling. So in that sense, I see it as a reinforcement of making sure that you have a good program in place, which is really the thrust in the US also. The difference in size here is not seen by FinCEN as an excuse to say that you can have a lower density or a more lenient program. You have to play by the same rules that are applicable to Puerto Rico entirely. All the federal rules are exactly the same. You need to have the 5 pillars. You have every violation under the code is the same here. Puerto Rico is a hybrid jurisdiction in other areas, but in terms of the BSA, it's just like being in Miami or being in LA in terms of the expectations on the entities here. And on the public, obviously, people who try to launder money, are facing those kinds of penalties, and there are money laundering cases associated with corruption. But those are more typical cases in the nation. And in that sense, I don't think that FinCEN is trying to isolate Puerto Rico. It's just to say that partly as a result of the relatively recent adoption of the GAP rule, which made it very explicit what everybody was kind of working under the assumption that it was anyway, that all the federal rules are applicable, that you need to have a full program in order to operate these entities, because as our public may or may not know, but the question is that the Puerto Rico IBs and IFEs are not by themselves federally supervised like a bank, in the sense of no FDIC insurance, they're not Fed members, they're not OCC national banks. So there are Puerto Rico entities that are not federally supervised. And that sort of gap was the gap that the FinCEN tried to cover. That also has included cooperatives in Puerto Rico. It's also included several non-insured banks in the US. So this is part of a nationwide trend, but there was obviously a large contingent of these kinds of entities in the IBE sector in Puerto Rico. Yeah. That's a very quick overview, but it gives you a sense that we're very much within the US. I think that's an important, again, factor to reiterate. It's not a rogue jurisdiction, and it's very much subject to the same rules as there are in the States. The thing is that every scandal or every bad news creates more noise and it's more attractive for press, and negative press tend to carry more than the business as usual kind of news.
Right. So you're referring to earlier the FinCEN GAP rule, I think from 2020, right? Or September 20.
I think it was finally adopted, like 2022 or something like that. It had been lingering since 2016, and it was sort of like the shoe waiting to drop. That made it just rounded out all the application of all the FinCEN rules generally to those who were non-federally supervised entities. And that's where Puerto Rico IBEs were. Right.
And since that rule was made, put into effect, obviously there's been some negative news, as you mentioned earlier. I remember you and I speaking about this topic about 4 years ago, and I wrote an article about the state of offshore banking in Puerto Rico with your assistance too, because you provided some great input then. And I remember then, in looking at the number of EBIs and FEs that were operating in Puerto Rico, was it seemed to be almost like at an all-time high, and there has seemed to be a kind of gradual decrease in the number of active EVs and FEs operating today in Puerto Rico. Can you talk a little bit about the trends, what you see in terms of the application process? I also know that there have been new types of institutions, digital banks, fintechs, that are moving into Puerto Rico. So can you talk a little bit about, do you see the EVs and FE sector kind of coming back to maybe pre-pandemic times? What do you see in terms of trends in the application process?
That's a very thorough and multi-part question that you're asking. But taking it by the IBEs themselves, the number is now, I was checking this morning, the list at the OCFI website shows 45 of the 273, the IFEs, and about 22 of the old IBEs. So technically speaking, there are about 67 now operating, down from about 80 something a couple of years ago.
Correct.
I think the reduction has been mainly a function of two things, which are two of the continuing challenges of the entities, whichever the ones that are here still, the ones that want to come in. You need to have strong capital, not just because the regulators say so, but because you need capital to be able to play the game. In other words, you have to be able to have the resources in terms of people and resources and technical systems and the capacity to attract business, obviously, because at the end of the day, this is a business, not just a compliance mode. But you need to have capital. And there has been a little bit of more pressure on being able to keep or attract more capital. Those that have not have been subject to more stronger enforcement actions by the OCFI. Some have also not been maybe so strong on the compliance side, and the exams have captured that. So there have been initiatives where the commissioner has either put cease and desist orders or have kind of led to voluntary and involuntary liquidation of a few entities. And that in itself has created a little bit of the wrong type of noise in a way as to what the market is looking like. But you have to see it as a process of transition into a mode where there's more enforcement, which was not required, if you want to put it that way, back in the 80s and 90s or 2000s, because everything was pretty stable and they were not finding major issues. But the issues have come in partly because also as a general proposition, the international market in which these entities have to play, both to get clients and to get a very important factor, which is sort of what I keep coming back to, the hidden key to a good operating system in Puerto Rico is to have good correspondent banking relationships. Because from Puerto Rico, you have to be able to play in the international payment system. Now, separate from the IBEs and the IFEs, that has been an area where there has been a big reduction generally of available commercial offers of correspondent banking services. Many US banks have done the classic de-risking issue, not only with Puerto Rico IBEs, but with generally any entity, structure, or jurisdiction which they saw as somehow being more risky to run the system. And since correspondent banking by itself is a high-risk proposition, if you're facing a perception or an image or a reality of more risk in a jurisdiction or more risk in certain types of entities, that has made it more difficult. The irony is that throughout the early 20s and to some extent 2010s, the main source of correspondent banking for services for the IBEs was the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And many still have the account with them, master account. Some have more sophisticated services. But the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, partly for their own growth and partly because of the entire perception of risk in the market, have been increasing the level of requirements that they want to have for these particular entities. And you now have a handbook that was published about 3 years ago, more frequent assessments done by independent entities. So what used to be a simpler relationship and a simpler way to get there into the payment system has become a little bit more difficult. They have closed some accounts. And that creates, some difficulties because the other thing you learn as you look through this universe is that not all correspondent banks are the same. So you may have some other correspondents in Europe or in Latin America, but maybe they're not as effective or maybe they don't have the high bandwidth to be able to handle what you really need. So losing the Fed is costly for those who had it. There are many who still get it. There are still many who are applying for that, but it has become a more challenging proposition to have that. But what is this, the flip side of that is that you have to see that as being stronger in your business model to be able to play in a game of correspondent banks generally. And some are getting back into US large-scale correspondent banks, being able to get that if you convince them that you have the right tools in place. So the market, not just the regulators, the market is creating more pressure to have stronger compliance, stronger capital, and stronger management at all levels. So you really have to play into that environment rather than blame any significant or one individual part of the environment, and realize that the opportunities are still there, because at the end of the day, Puerto Rico still has the offer of tax incentives. We have a jurisdiction under the US flag, which does provide obviously the level of economic stability, political stability. And the one that we're trying to regain is more the sense of regulatory stability, which it had, but there was an assessment done by the Treasury that put Puerto Rico in being susceptible to.
Yeah.
It didn't say it was corrupted, but it said it was susceptible to money laundering. So once you get those kinds of shadows in the lighting, you have to overcome those to be able to gain back your reputation, because we are within the US system, and the US also helping, for example, Europe at one point in time try to put Puerto Rico in a suspect jurisdiction level. And the US Treasury combated that because they said, well, they may have some issues, but they are subject to US law, subject to US law enforcement. And there's no real safe harbor for people who are looking to do money laundering. There will be rule of law, and there will be consequences if you try to play against those rules.
Right.
So I think the benefits and the advantages of the local market are not gone. It's just that the economic pressure to succeed are a little bit more challenging, and you need more resources.
And to that point, I understand that the current commissioner of the OSIF, Ms. Sequeira, has been pushing for modifications to the law that governs these international banking entities. I don't think that's been finalized, but can you talk a little bit about what is the aim? I understand there's capital requirements that are being expanded. Can you talk a little bit about what the proposed modifications are, and then what the status is of when that could, whether it's going to be approved or not, and when?
Well, on the proposal itself, the key highlights are the increase in paid-in capital requirement, particularly for those who want to take deposits. The IBEs, by the way, have other authorities that they can have, and not all of them are depository institutions, but that is the main thrust, and obviously that's what makes it so attractive to fintechs, which we'll get later to that.
Sure.
But the matter of the capital requirement, the law, in the way the law reads right now, from 1989 and even the 273-2012 Act, it said that you needed $250,000 paid in capital to start and get a license. That's right. That's just impossible. You don't even get your office probably for that amount anymore. You need to have some restricted assets, so you need to have a lot more capital than that. And there were many that were coming in with a short amount of millions, let's put it that way, into getting into the system. But as the depository business has grown and they have faced issues with the liquidations, the OCFI has said, well, we're going to have to push not only as a policy of more capital, but we're going to have to need the support of the legal system or the statute itself, the law. So they're increasing the required minimum amount of paid-in capital to $10 million. Again, that's partly a pressure point, but it's also a reflection of what is needed to be able to achieve compliance and success in this area. Obviously, that doesn't make everybody happy, because if you're already here and you don't have $10 million already placed, that's not a fun thing to do, to tomorrow put in $6 million or whatever you need to do. So they're proposing to give a staggered period of up to 5 or 6 years to reach the amounts. But you always have to be aware that it also will have to be in compliance with capital ratios that are modeled on the US federal capital ratio. So if you've grown too fast, you're going to need more capital regardless of this law to be able to meet. If you have, $100 million in assets, then you're going to probably need more than $5 million in capital anyway. Mm-hmm. So that's one way of in which the law is trying to at the same time adapt and force others to adapt to the times. In other areas, there are some costs that are being increased partly to make it a little bit more cost effective for the government to handle the applications. They proposed to have $1 million license fee initially, and that was viewed by too many as too steep, almost a barrier to entry. It's being proposed to be lowered to, I believe, it's $100,000, which is still steep, but it's much less. Yeah. Right now, it's $5,000, so it gives you a sense of how old the law was that it had such low numbers, and they've had to be a little drastic in pushing higher numbers.
Right.
The renewals are going to be $75,000, which is again not the minimis, but it's still not as much as they had proposed. Another important area is in the area of employment in Puerto Rico. You need to have at least 8. Right now, you need to have at least 4 FTEs living in Puerto Rico. Now they're going to raise that to 8 FTEs living in Puerto Rico, 2 of whom have to be in compliance with a very competent compliance officer. That specification is not in the current law, but it will be approved in the bill if approved. So there are some other enforcement-related areas that are being introduced, such as having an independent director in the board of the IABE or the IFE.
Right.
The definition of that is still a little bit in flux, but essentially what they want to have is to make sure that there's somebody who's really kind of being a third party looking at compliance and looking at the performance of the entity rather than just the shareholders.
Would there be a requirement for that independent director to be part of the compliance committee?
Not necessarily, but it would make sense.
Okay.
It would make a lot of sense because that that's more natural.
Yeah. And what is the status of approval? Is that go ahead.
Yeah, the status of approval is, Puerto Rico process of legislation is complicated because the executive is governed by one branch and by one party. The legislature is not exactly run completely by the other. It's even got a split model. But in any event, before getting into politics, the bills were filed in both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, equally and different times this year. The House has approved the original bill without some of the changes that even the commissioner had proposed, which was to reduce, for example, the $1 million initial license fee to $100,000. She had written to them to propose to change that, but it was approved just as filed. So now it's in the Senate, and the Senate will have to take on the amendment of the bill to reflect these modifications and any other thing that comes around in terms of lobbying by the industry. There have been other comments, and it can get pretty elaborate to get into that, but there's a number of other technicalities that need to be addressed and checked in terms of things that are being adapted, such as what I mentioned, the independent director. A definition of that is still a little bit complicated.
Right.
The matter of capital requirements based on the federal guidelines, the language needs to be tempered, and they try to do a little bit of reserve authority to the commissioner, but so that by way of regulation they can finesse or finalize some of the details in the proposals that are being made. I think those are probably the key highlights of where we are right now. I think the Senate's going to move fast. There's a lot of interest on the executive side and the commissioner to get these changes in place, partly, again, to reflect the fact that the market needs them in the sense of making sure that we have that kind of structure in place, and also to have, frankly, to have a little bit more dialogue or leverage in terms of discussing this matter with other regulators, including the federal regulators, including the FinCEN, including to some extent foreign regulators, to make sure that the market retains the fact that we're in a strongly regulated place, which is one of the areas that has always been an attractive spot or an attractive point for entities to come in. I said, we want to go to a place that doesn't have the gray area of other jurisdictions that go up and down in terms of their status or the reputation of their regime. So it's been a little bit damaged, but it's still there, and we need to make sure it stays there.
And clearly, and to demonstrate to the world outside of Puerto Rico that that not only the commissioner but the government is being proactive about making sure that.
That's a good point. Yes. So she has that full support. She's also had a little bit more support than had been available. As you know, Puerto Rico went through really tough times in terms of the economics of the government. It's still to some extent, the promesa, the bankruptcy of the government bonds.
Right.
But even through that, there's been a little progress in terms of more support for what the commissioner is trying to do in her office. Number of examiners, the salary of these examiners has been able to go up finally, because it was getting really hard to retain people who were more experienced.
Right.
So that's sort of an outlook of where we are in terms of that. I think the Senate, those who may be looking for that, they have to look to the Senate now for what's going to happen in the final. What's going to probably be the final look of the bills.
So by this time next year, that it'll be more than you expect it to be approved, and we're talking about a different regulatory and application environment.
They like to get it approved in the next month.
Okay, good.
We'll
I'm building some time there, knowing how these things do take time.
It won't go away if it's not approved in a month, but they're trying to get it done in this legislative session, which I think ends in mid-November or late November.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would have to again be picked up in January, but then we're talking about an election year. So, the agenda in the legislature gets very cluttered as you get near the elections, as it happens in the States also.
I wanted to ask you this because I've always been curious about the value proposition that EBIs and FEs offer to the non-domestic customer. And so just if for a business operating in Buenos Aires, for example, just to, pick on Buenos Aires for a minute, that has not established a correspondent account in the United States with a U.S. bank and is approached by a Puerto Rican bank to open an account there. What is the value proposition in that context that the international banking entity or the EBIC can offer a foreign customer? What is that value proposition? Because and the reason I ask this more so is, we've seen in recent press reports how some of these institutions that were forced to close their operations or found in violation of something, none of these institutions are FDIC insured. So your deposits are not FDIC insured. And there's been reports about customers trying to get their deposits back, and it's taken some time. So obviously that might scare away a customer because of that one concept. But talk a little bit about the insurance, how that impacts a customer, and again, really just coming back to the value proposition that a EBI can offer a non-domestic customer.
Okay, well, I think the key point that you're mentioning there is that they are not FDIC insured. That is true, and they cannot advertise otherwise. So,
correct.
Nobody should be fooled to believe that they are going to be FDIC insured. The membership is not really a membership with the bank. Those that have a Federal Reserve Bank account, what they will have access to is the payment system, but they are not members of the Fed in the sense that a bank in the U.S. can become a member of the Fed with capital in the Federal Reserve Bank. The Fed has two hats. Federal Reserve Bank of New York is, in a way, the regulator deputized by the Federal Reserve Board to handle the banks and the holding companies in the region, just as in any other, the 11 or 13 billions that there are of the Fed. But they also have the Federal Reserve Bank as a banker's bank, so to speak, which handles the banking system, the payment system for the banks in the region also. Puerto Rican banks have always been in the New York Fed. So Puerto Rico as a jurisdiction has been placed under that. So the access to the Federal Reserve Bank account has always been a good, strong, positive point. I did mention, though, that the Fed has been a little bit tougher in terms of what it expects to have from the banks who have an account with them. And that's not going to go back because it's achieved a level of requirement that they're not going to relent on that. It's not going to go away. So long as you meet those expectations, you will have access, and you will have access to a very sophisticated payment system. Right. So the fact that a bank that is able to get that account or something similar with another commercial bank can offer that is to give that Argentine client that you're mentioning access to the worldwide payment system in a very effective and efficient way. And maybe in a jurisdiction or with a bank that may be a little bit more willing to take on the risk
right,
that foreign client. And that's why they're, to some extent, that that illustrates something that's happened. A lot of the entities that have come in have been from outside Puerto Rico, particularly in the last 20 years. Colombia, Venezuela, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Europe, now recently Asia. Obviously, an entity that comes here is not looking for a business clientele in Puerto Rico. They have to have their own worldwide or global clientele based on the jurisdiction from where they come or for what they may have developed in terms of relations, whether as part of a holding company or as part of other affiliations that they've had. So in that sense, Puerto Rico offers a good location for first U.S. deposits, U.S. dollar-based deposits in a regulated jurisdiction under the rule of law. There are some troubles in the recent liquidations, but I think that's something that's going to be a little bit of a growing process because there hadn't been that many. There's not really a full-blown bankruptcy type approach, but the commissioner has taken great pains to make sure that there's a level playing field among depositors. That's made it slower, and that's made it some risk. I think in the future, obviously, people will have to look more carefully at the financial strength of the institution in which they place the money. I think, in that sense, there was a lot of faith in the fact that they would continue to go on. But if you lose correspondence or if you lose capital or you're subject to enforcement, then obviously your ability to service those clients is going to get more difficult. And there's not going to be an FDIC type takeover that's going to either ride out with insurance or transfer you automatically to another institution that's going to take care of all the problems. So this has been a little bit of a growing, evolving process in terms of how to depurate or clean out, if you will, or make sure that not clean out. I mean it more in the sense of understanding how to do those processes that have never been as prevalent as it has been in the last few years.
Right.
So there's a learning curve going on in that to some extent, but I think it will show that again the rule of law prevails and that the commissioner will have an interest and make sure that it's run as fairly and as efficiently as possible, and trying to create models that will make it easier to do that in the future with having more capital, having better compliance, and making sure that you can avoid having weaker institutions remain in the system.
Okay. And I had asked this question before. I want to come back to it, which is about the applications. Can you talk a little bit about fintechs? I read an article yesterday that President Biden named, 30 different cities to be, fintech hubs and receive some federal incentives for that. And San Juan is one of them, Puerto Rico. So talk a little bit about the fintech scene. Are those types of institutions applying for these types of licenses? And then just to get a sense of the again, we talked a little bit about landscape, but more specifically, the definition of a financial institution has expanded in the last 5 to 10 years, right? And who provides financial services and payments. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective on the financial technology firms, startups, what have you, on the island.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Generally, I know that fintechs obviously are a strong force in the entire financial system.
Right.
To some extent, I try to keep it in two tracks, so to speak. The fintechs are very good at developing technology and financial technology, and that's why they call them that, fintechs. So it's financial technology that enables handling of payments, handling of applications, streamlining a lot of the operations that the banks have, in which legacy systems may be a little bit slow still because of the size of the bank, because of the history of the bank. So you're having a lot of fintechs many of them are startups, but they're very efficient and they offer new services. So in a way, you can see fintechs as being the next wave of banking operations generally. The thing is, what makes it a challenging proposition from a regulatory standpoint is that the fintechs as entities do not have the banking compliance structure that the bank has. That makes them at one time more efficient because you don't need to carry the huge baggage of having more people in compliance. You're basically dedicated to selling a service or to selling a type of system. While the banks are still clunking along a little bit with a larger system and huge compliance task, and they're not getting any easier. We haven't talked about that. The banks are not, in a free in a free zone, exempt from more regulation. That is just,
Right.
that's not happening.
It's not happening.
That's not happening. So I think the fintechs have a little bit of trouble getting into the financial system completely, because some of them would like to have, in order to handle the amount of payments that they can do for many clients, they would love to have the depository institution in place. And the IBEs, IFEs look like a less costly, even if not FDIC insured type operation, where you can have deposits and handle those as part of your client base. But it's not that easy, because then you need to anyway, under the IBE model, create a bank in a sense of full compliance with capital, with compliance with BSA requirements. And integrating those two is not as simple as it looks. At least that's been my experience. So in that sense, fintech banks sort of have not really happened. Some of them are happening. They just started an internet bank here in Puerto Rico that is in the growing process.
Right.
It actually got FDIC insurance. It's not an IBE. Oh. It's a full commercial bank.
Oh, okay.
Nave,
Nave. I saw the news on that. Yeah. So that's a full commercial bank.
That's a full commercial bank with FDIC insurance, Fed membership, the works.
Okay.
That's positive news, because that was done in the island with basically local staffing and local capital, with a lot of U.S. support also, obviously, with so many other institutions,
right,
and a lot of hard work to get it done. But it again reinforces the fact that, there is credibility to the system here. But in terms of what fintechs do, we have seen applicants or people who are interested in trying to set up an IBE, and sometimes in the process, the amounts of capital being required, it's like developing a new limb, so to speak, for them to create a more depository type institution. So in that sense, I think the mix is not being as easy as maybe it's been advertised. Although they have been able to provide payment services to many banks and use banks as on the BASS model, that, well, you can give me the money and we'll place it in a bank for you. Those has its own risk also, because there are different arrangements between the payment processors and the banks in which they collocate the money. So it's a challenging area. That's one that I think it's been oversimplified in the press, or at least in the appearances of what it is in the press, in settling it down into brass tacks in terms of how to integrate with banking. It's a little bit more. It takes a little bit more work. Let's put it that way. You have to be very careful with the arrangements and the contracts that are being made.
Right. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what, as partner, capital member of Mecano Valdez, what type of work are you doing, the last year or so? What's kind of keeping you busy these days in general terms? Of course, you can't talk about any clients, but just a type of just to kind of understand, has that always remained the same? What's sort of new, what's trending in your practice at the firm?
We've been fortunate in the sense that we've been able to stay, very involved in many types of M&A deals. Generally, Puerto Rico, there's still a lot of investment coming in. The energy sector has been developing a lot of interest in terms of alternative energy, also systems trying to plug into what the local system is, which has been very weak, but it's hopefully going to become more resilient, as we call it, to handle events. Although, every time it rains too hard here, you begin to worry about it. But it's still improving, and there's more interest in bringing that kind of technical support. So our firm, my main area is financial, but in terms of responding to your question, how we adapt and how we service what is happening in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of M&A work being done, energy work is being done. People are still buying real estate. There's many opportunities both on the housing and the commercial side,
right,
to develop new areas or new building structures or new emphasis. There's quite a large amount of federal funds being made available, both in terms of emergency funds and the community development funds that are still available. So again, our presence under the U.S. flag and system, even though it's not exactly the same as it is in the States in every area, still obviously allows for a large support system in terms of economics that continue to bring stability. to the island. And, I'm an optimist. So in that sense, I like to think that we'll go through hard times, but in the end, the people here are very hardworking. Our firm works very hard. In the financial area, we're seeing applications less, but we're working with clients who are here to make sure that they can, navigate through the changes that we're talking about, and very close association with the regulators to understand where their expectations are and to maintain our credibility with them, which is very, very important to be able to assist our clients. And the hotel industry is also very, very strong here in Puerto Rico. So it's an optimistic environment, and fortunately, if we stay away from hurricanes for a couple more years, it will level out. The bankruptcy of the government has not helped either, but that's also being put down as a past, even though it's not completely out of the woods yet.
Right. Okay. All right. I'll ask you one last question on this, and in terms of best practices for the EVI and FE sector. So a new applicant. And did you say earlier that you're seeing less applications at the firm?
Yeah, they have slowed down. I think
they have slowed down.
Everybody's kind of taking a second look at the new proposed rules with new laws.
Okay.
So, if you were looking at maybe $2 to $5 million entry, and then all of a sudden you're looking at a $10 million entry, you have to think whether you have the support to do that, or it changes in the look of the business plan that you may have had in mind.
Right.
Hopefully that will not, take everyone away from the interest, but it will certainly require a calibration of the business plan that you have for coming into Puerto Rico when you have to start at $10 million with capital. It's still interesting. It still has the benefits. It still has the tax benefits, but obviously it's a larger type scale.
It's a larger investment. Yeah. So just to conclude on that question. So best practice in terms of either existing EVIs and FEs operating in Puerto Rico to ensure, full compliance, and expectations of both the state and the federal. Can you talk about sort of 2-3 key things that institutions need to be pursuing?
Yeah, I think the keys are related both to the business and to the regulation, as I've sort of worked through.
Sure.
One is capital. You need to make sure that you have strong capital, not only in what you have available, but also making sure that you have investors who are willing to support the entity to the extent that it may be necessary in a downtime or in a situation where you want to expand. You need to make sure that you have that capital resource in hand. Make sure that you allocate to compliance. I was in a forum this past week, and there was a very good image said, well, the compliance is sort of the foundation. You don't really see it from the outside, but if you don't have a strong foundation in compliance, you can get very vulnerable to regulatory interventions, or even worse, to fraud or money laundering. And that exposes the beautiful building that you made to be cluttered from the inside.
Right.
In terms of having strong or having an attack that can go. And we should not forget to mention that everybody needs to also be aware of technology.
Sure, cybersecurity.
We cannot disregard those. Those are more threats to this present environment. And also make sure to get competent staff, particularly in the compliance area. Because again, we're playing in a compliance area which is national in scope. The market here, no matter how small the institutions may look, you still need to have a very strong compliance personnel that can address examinations, that can address in setting up programs and systems that the entity will need to have.
Right.
And technology helps in that area very much. And also make sure that you have a good business plan, because again, the more these costs increase, the more you need to make sure that you know where to get new clients and where to get new funds. And that's really much more a business proposition. I tell the clients that our main concern with you is to make sure that you have a good business plan. We'll help you with the legal side of that business plan, but the legal is not going to make the business. The legal is going to help you make sure that you're in compliance, that you can get it done under the right licensing that you may require. But at the end of the day, the business is the business. And if you have a good business plan, I'm sure we'll work it through with you and be able to get it through with the regulators and hopefully with the market. But so the lawyers are here to help. But the business is got to be very careful in setting up a strong business plan, and we'll be glad to help in that.
Right. Okay. So we're just about out of time. So Ernesto, thank you. I think this was very valuable for the audience. I do like to always end on a lighter note, and we've done this with all of our podcast guests, and ask a different type of question. I'm a fervent fan of music, enthusiastic fan of all kinds of genres of music. So I'm going to ask you a music question, right? So you're living in Puerto Rico on the island, La Isla del Encanto, and I want to ask you about what I think is the island's most profitable export, which is reggaeton. Mm-hmm. And and interesting, we were talking earlier about New York, the New York Fed, New York, Puerto Rico. There's always been this kind of symbiotic relationship between both jurisdictions. I think there's about 500,000 Puerto Ricans living in New York today. The large concentration of Puerto Ricans living in New York are living in the Bronx. The Bronx just happens to be the birthplace of American hip hop music in the early 80s. And obviously, reggaeton is a derivative of hip hop music. And so looking at reggaeton, do you have a favorite reggaeton artist? There are so many going back to, Daddy Yankee and even today, the probably the most popular artist in the world, Bad Bunny, is from the island. Do you have a favorite artist? Do you have any commentary about reggaeton? I'm eager to hear you as a very senior member of the community of Puerto Rico. And
okay, I'll take that part first. I think in terms of having a favorite, I cannot say I have a favorite in the sense of listening all the time.
Of course,
and
you probably can't. You probably can't not listen to it because it's probably all around you.
You'd be surprised. I listen to a lot. I was born in 1956, just to put it in perspective. So the 60s were around when I was a young teenager. Right. 70s, 80s. Lived in the States, lived in Puerto Rico. Know both sides. Love music. Love jazz. Love. I saw that you had that possible note here, mm-hmm. and talking to one of my colleagues here. In 2016, I went to see a Metallica concert here in Puerto Rico.
Excellent.
Which, did some brain damage to my brain. And I'm not a Metallica fan also, but I think what you bring out, and I love the history of music. I mean, the history of salsa is an amazing journey through the Caribbean. Yeah. The fact that the Cuban influence, the guaguancó, developing and expanding into the salsa, the urbanization of salsa in the 70s with Willie Colon and all those guys in New York, right. And also coming back. So how those develop into hip hop and into reggaeton and stay in Puerto Rico have a lot to do with the fact that people love music here anyway, very supportive of local artists. So, you can see Bad Bunny, for example, being a huge worldwide phenomenon, but he's very clear that his main base of support in terms of having an image for his music and an image for his persona is Puerto Rico. And I think it's been pretty remarkable how many or most of these big artists, Daddy Yankee obviously being one of the main ones.
Sure.
And others that too many to mention, and I don't want to miss anyone who's too important.
Yeah,
Tego Calderón, all those guys. They've always kept a very strong Puerto Rican image, but at the same time a very global or urban even dimension to them.
Correct.
So in that sense, I think it's what's made it very eclectic. It's also very challenging in terms of I know many people complain about the lyrics of some of these songs, particularly the trap version of these. But it seems to be leveling into a situation where people who you thought would be offended by it are not really that offended by it anymore.
Well, it's become part of the mainstream. Yeah, I think it's become
a phenomenon by itself.
Yeah, it is. I would love to talk more about this for 20 minutes.
We could for 10 hours.
I see that we're running out of time very quickly, but I'm amazed. Living in Miami. Every time you're out on the beach, everybody has reggaeton playing from, and it's not just Puerto Rican reggaeton. I mean, you have it in Colombia, Dominican Republic, but but I think the birthplace is Puerto Rico.
But notice that you're mentioning the same hotbeds of salsa. So
I am, yeah, of course.
It's like the perfect crucible for all these
course.
music. I mean, it spawns different types of music, but it's still culturally aligned in the area. So
I agree with you. Well, this was a great way to wrap it up. And again, I always like to finish on a lighter note. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you for all your input, and it was a great conversation. With that, we're going to wrap up. Thank you for watching and listening. Again, if you like the podcast, please subscribe below, and we look forward to seeing you at the next podcast. Thank you very much, Ernesto.
Thank you, Alberto. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you.
We'll take off the music talk later.
Sounds good. All right, bye-bye.